Aloha and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Got Your Six podcast. This six-question podcast brings together high performers to share their methods, strategies, and ideas, delivered in an informative and, most importantly, actionable way that'll help you lead yourself and those around you from the battlefield to the boardroom. Coming to you every episode, I'm your host, Tony Nash. And into the breach.
Nothing mentioned on this podcast is an endorsement or opinion of the Department of Defense.
I got your six, we got your back. Got your six, we got your back. Got your six, we got your back. I got your six.
Sixers, today we are joined. You might not know his face, but you definitely know his work. Steve Leonard, the creator of Doctrine Man, is here with us today. We're going to dive into his new book, To Boldly Go, touch on the science fiction and leadership connections. I'm just super excited. Thank you, sir, so much for being here today.
Hey, Tony, thanks a lot for having me. I've been a big fan of your podcast for a while and your work in general. And, you know, it was a dream come true to have you reach out and ask. And I'm just glad we did it and surprised we haven't done it sooner.
Absolutely. As we said before the show, right? The kids always say real recognizes real. And that's something I think people say when they feel like they're too old to actually say it, but want to say it anyway. So the new book is out. Just let's talk about it. Where did you come up with the idea?
So believe it or not, this book has a genesis at the military academy. I've been aligned and been working with the Modern War Institute there for about 5 years. And I'm a senior fellow there. And one of the other fellows, Mick Ryan, Major General Mick Ryan of the Australian Army, he and I were having dinner a couple of years ago, listening to General Williams talk. And Mick leaned across the table and says, "Mate, I have an idea." And it was one of those things where I'm a big idea guy. So I'm like, "Hey, let's talk it." And he laid it out. He said, "We ought to do this." And it just grew from there. And I sat down with a buddy of mine, John Klug, my co-editor, who's also a USMA grad, and said, "Hey, what do you think? You want to be part of this?" And he's also a huge science fiction nerd, so it was really an easy choice for him. And so we kind of just spent a couple of months pulling the idea together, how we wanted to break things down, what areas we wanted to cover, and then we went into a search for a publisher. And the idea was leadership and strategy and, you know, conflict. And we weren't sure how a publisher would receive that. And we literally got to go with the first publisher we sent a draft to. And it wasn't even a draft manuscript. It was a draft proposal. "Hey, this is a big idea we have. What do you think?" And email back the same day, "Yes, we're in. Let's do this." And I'm told from people who have published before that this is not how it normally works. So
that's
I feel
unheard
really
of.
fortunate to be able to say, "Hey, we got a first time go with a publisher." And then it was just a matter of building a team of people. And, you know, we put a lot of effort into tapping into our own personal networks, people that we knew, friends that we've made, people that we've worked with before, because there were two other books that kind of preceded this, Strategy Strikes Back and Winning Westeros, which were largely built around the Modern War Institute team. But everybody kind of moved on from those, and we still had some energy left. So let's take this idea of Mick Ryan's and let's see what we could do with it and push it out into some areas where we hadn't tried before. And one of those was science fiction beyond the Star Wars universe. So let's just do science fiction in general. Let's see if we can get a really broad group of writers with a lot of different experiences. And so we ended up with a crew, so like half male, half female, literally they stretch from New Zealand to the West Coast of the United States, with, you know, people that were in England, people that were serving in Mali at the time, people all over the globe writing on this. So it's a rare thing, I suppose, just to be able to pull something like that together, but also to do it during a time of COVID, because the idea pre-existed the outbreak of the pandemic, and we did all the coordination, all the meetings, everything right in the midst of the pandemic. So it was it's our little pandemic baby, I guess, if you want to call it that, as freakish as that sounds. But that's it in a nutshell. And then just give people the freedom to be able to write what they want to write. And that was something that I felt, I'm probably babbling on, but something that was really important to us was that we add a little structure up front, but then give the writers the absolute freedom to pick their own source material and their own lessons within each one of the bins that we picked. And we had 6 bins overall. There's a certain amount of risk to that, but I think the reward comes on the backside when you start to read what's in the book and you see some of the amazing stuff. What happens when you don't tell somebody what to do, but you tell them, or you don't tell somebody how to do it, but here's what I need. And Tony, you have the absolute freedom to write what you want. And then people just produce this magnificent work. And you talking authors that may range from, an Australian Army major to Max Brooks, who wrote World War Z, people who are major players in the think tank circuit to people that are working in the Pentagon, just everywhere, people all over the place. And the end result has just been terrific.
There's 2 things I really want to dive in there. One is you're essentially making commander's intent as a writer for your audience, right? Implementing that from the military. Hey, here's the loose structure, go forth and do it. But as a commander too, you also know that risk is a potential catalyst that fuels opportunity, right? I know we talked, kind of went back and forth on LinkedIn about Captain Kirk and what he feels about risk. And it really, really underlines that to an extent that I don't think a lot of people understand, at least without kind of seeing this now in action with a framework like you presented.
Yeah, I think people, I'm glad that you pointed that out, because I think some people don't absolutely understand that whole idea that with a little bit of guidance and commander's intent, there's almost nothing that you can't accomplish if you allow people the freedom to be who they are and to think for themselves. You're always going to find people who can't operate within commander's intent, or you're going to find people who require an excessive amount of guidance. But I've always been a believer that if I have to tell you what to do and how to do it, then I can just do it myself. Why I don't need to waste that time or effort to try to get you in the right direction. If you can't figure it out, I'll find somebody else who can. And we applied that same philosophy with the book. And I think that's kind of important. One is the quickest way to turn off a bunch of independent minds that are really capable people and hugely talented is to tell them how to write and what, here's exactly what I need from you. I need you to watch this episode of Deep Space Nine and, tell me about, with the, Quark in the wormhole and, what he did here. No, that just shuts people down immediately. So it's just a broad guidance and intent. Here's a deadline. I need something by this date. And you tell me what you want to write about. You tell me where you want to focus, and that's it. And I would say that worked for about 95% of the pieces. And a couple of pieces came back, and we had to work with the authors. But when the other 95% are on target the first time, hey, you're in a good place. And that allows you to have the freedom of maneuver, really, to spend all that extra time with somebody else that really could use some help, or maybe they got writer's block, or they're just not inspired, but they can write. You just kind of got to help them along. And that philosophy applies well just about anywhere. That if you can get with the right people and you give them that latitude and maneuver space, that they'll impress you most of the time.
Absolutely. I mean, you could speak to this on an array of different aspects. As you look to, when you were a cartoonist, everyone starts with a blank piece of paper. How you go and form that to, create jokes that, we understand in the military across the board. It wasn't you just showed up one day and you're this great cartoonist. You had to iterate and get with people that were better than you. That's essentially mentorship 101.
Oh, absolutely. And that was something that, as I started, the whole cartoon thing was a freakish little thing. I have zero artistic talent. I couldn't draw a cartoon if I had to, which is why you see stick figures. And the underlying joke in there is that all those stick figures are created in PowerPoint. because where do we spend 90% of our time? In PowerPoint. So it was that little joke, if you paid close attention, that yeah, all these things are built into PowerPoint. And then the source material was, I'm very much a believer in, you just have to be patient and allow the ideas to present themselves. And if you're patient and you let that happen, then the situation will always resolve itself. You'll see what you need to see. And it's funny that you bring any of this up, because I had a piece come out last week in my Point of Departure blog that was about General Odierno and the passing of General Odierno. And he actually had a character and did for about 7 years. The character debuted after we were going through a series of briefings with him over Doctrine 2015 and God knows whatever else. But he had a certain animated style to himself. And by this point, I'm a colonel. I'm the G3 at Fort Leavenworth. And colonels aren't supposed to misbehave during these meetings, but I would watch him and he would wave his arms around. He would gesture. And I thought, my God, that's just like when Larry David does George Steinbrenner on Seinfeld, because you always saw the back of Steinbrenner. He'd wave his arms around, and I'm like, oh my God, that's the chief. That's the chief. And then I bring the two of them together, except you got a bald-headed character with 4 stars on his shoulders, and he would have to deal with the ass hattery that exists within the Pentagon, and how a normal person in his role would deal with it. Of course, you'd wave your hands around. How could you do this? Why would you? Why do I have to put up with this? And that was all him. And I thought it was pretty clever, and I didn't give it much of a thought. And as I tell in the piece that I wrote, we were sitting down to talk about something one day, and I was only kind of half-heartedly paying attention. And he makes a comment, none of what's said in this meeting better show up in a cartoon. And I looked up and he was looking at me. And I'm like, holy hell, he knows. Like, oh my God. I mean, how could you know? And I suppose if you paid any attention to the cartoon, you'd put 2 and 2 together. And he's like, that guy's writing about me. And I was, but I didn't think the chief of all people would have ever noticed that. And he did. And it was just this little epiphany that, oh my, I've done this cartoon for a few years. People in seats of power actually pay attention to what we do. And it's not just a cartoon, it's other things. And those moments when they hit you, when you think you're just this anonymous major, you're just going about his day-to-day job. And then one day the chief of staff of the Army stands next to you and say, hey, Tony, how you been? And you realize, hey, he knows who I am. How do you know who I am? What did I do? And oh, Tony, I was reading that article that you wrote during CGSC about, how stupid all chiefs were, and it really struck a chord with me. But it's like those little things in life that you're never as anonymous as you think you are, which is always a good lesson to teach everybody, especially people who hang out on social media and think that nobody knows who they are. Somebody always knows who you are. And one of the important lessons in life then is you're never as anonymous as you think you are. And anonymity is just a veil, and people can see through it. You may not be able to see out, people can see through it, and they know who you are. It's always a good one to take to the bank afterwards too, because you don't want to be the person who gets surprised that the chief actually knows who you are and what you've been writing about him. Those are good lessons to share too.
Absolutely. No, I'm glad you really brought that up, because that is something sometimes we overlook. We get so focused on the day-to-day grind. We never know who's watching. And it completely takes you from left field to right field when it does hit you and people are like, hey, I see you. We recognize what you're doing, either good or bad. And you always
good or bad.
Yeah.
I prefer it to be good. If
I agree.
If I can have any control over that. I never want to be the guy who shows up in the news and they shake their head and they're like, that guy. Well, whoever gave him a microphone? I don't ever want to be that guy.
Yes, sir. So now with the book done, going out, and it's going to start to grow, which is really cool, talking to different authors, and they talk about how their books kind of grow beyond what they originally set it out to do, and it becomes organic. What really is like kind of your biggest takeaway having to go through, and like you said, mentor some writers, kind of provide that commander's intent and then see what the next evolution of that is. Is there something you took away from that whole, kind of iteration?
So it's that I took a lot away from the experiences. There was actually 3 different books that I worked on, 3 different anthologies before this. I mentioned Strategy Strikes Back and Winning Westeros. And then we worked with the Military Writers Guild. We produced Why We Write, which was supposed to inspire potential military writers, or really any writer. It's like, hey, what drives you to write? And you take away lessons from each one of those. Like the first 2 books, the importance of at least being able to provide minimal guidance. Those were great projects, but I think that the editors and the editorial staff had to deal with, we didn't do any bending up front. So we said broadly, we're going to do leadership and strategy, blah, blah, blah. Well, okay, give me some framework to work with. And so what we did then was, when we moved into To Boldly Go and laid out, hey, here are the 6 bins, if you want to call them bins, but the 6 areas we're going to focus on: leadership, and here's what we're talking about, strategy, here's what we're talking about, conflict, here's what we're talking about, the dark side of leadership, here's what we're talking about. So it was detailed guidance, but broad enough that allowed people the freedom to write within those. And then what I drew from Why We Write was the importance of narrowing the aperture. So we put out a broad call for papers with Why We Write, and I think we had like 300 submissions. We had enough for like 2 huge tomes, and then you had to whittle that down. And so for us, we discussed a call for papers, and I nixed that on day 1 and said, no, we're going to handpick the people we write, and we're going to work with them. And that way, it's a select group of people, but it will allow us to really narrow that aperture to a point where we're only getting the input that we need, and we don't have a lot of extra articles or extra chapters left over. And picking enough people that we had some room for attrition on the backside, which we lost a couple of writers, one to a contract dispute, and one just didn't produce a chapter. But that was all built in. I figured, hey, we're going to give ourselves about 10% a failure rate, just in the event that something bad happens. And that allowed us to work through those. Going forward, because there will be a sequel to this, I just don't know when it's going to come out. And the subject matter will be slightly different. Everything that we tried with this one worked. And so going forward, I think it's just tweaking the formula, maybe giving ourselves a little bit more time in terms of editing. I think the publisher wanted everybody to submit their chapters on like December 31st, with the book being due January 31st to them, and realizing, you have like 300 pages of hard editing to do in 30 days. And it was a grind. Yeah. And we're going to look, next time we do this, we're going to give ourselves more time. That's a little bit, it'll help. The other thing was, one of the things that we tried to do that's a common criticism is there weren't enough women in the first couple of books that we worked on. You'd get like 28 male authors and 2 female authors, and so we said from the get-go, we're going to do 50-50, and that way I wanted to ensure a good split there. And then the international piece came in. You end up with a much more diverse view of things, and I think that helps, because the women authors, my God, the things they wrote about were just absolutely fantastic. Gender equity, what was a big one that came out. They brought those writers just brought a different perspective that I think we would have lost had we had a purely male group of writers. And in the same sense, bringing in authors from all around the world, you also got a different perspective there. You brought in people from other services. So, we had Navy writers, we had Air Force writers, we had Army writers. I think we might have had a Marine at one point. You just get this great mix of people, and trying to, with that formula going forward, how do you make that even better? And I'm not sure there's a way to make it any better than we already did, but we're going to try. And every time I've mentioned the next idea, and I won't say it here, but every time I mention the next idea, I have offers. Hey, I want to write. I mean, it's that kind of thing. It's something that's, science fiction is a good bed to work from. If you think in your mind, if I had to pick another genre to write from, what would it be?
Right.
I'm asking you.
Oh,
what would it be?
I don't. Outside of science fiction?
Yeah. And don't say fantasy, because somebody else recommended fantasy, and I'm like, well, I don't know. Beyond the Lord of the Rings and a few other things, that's really going to pull you back into a niche. So, I mean, think in terms of what kinds of movies are really hot. What are your billion-dollar movie makers right now?
I mean, you can I'm thinking like big blockbusters, like summer explosions kind of thing. What's hot right now? I don't know.
I know I put you on the spot.
You did. I don't know. Like, are we talking like a Netflix in theaters?
That would be interesting.
I mean, the jungle, like even like look at what the Dwayne the Rock Johnson did with the jungle genre, and taking that from like being like Anaconda to, a whole different world with a bunch of different movies. So there's a ton of different ways I can see you look at through different lenses at different problems.
Yeah. So like, I will tell you that the next one is going to be fun. Preliminary go from the publisher. I've got to lock that in the next 30 days or so and attack it. And it's going to be a lot of fun. And we're going to try to go for the same kind of publication time frame. So around this time again in 2 years, if we're lucky. And I think that we're going to have about at least 6 movies come out in this genre between now and the time we publish. So there'll be lots of source material.
Sixers, you heard it here first. It's out there. We'll talk about this in a future episode, but you heard it here on the Got Your Six podcast.
Yeah, and you're gonna see leadership and character and values, human conflict, the whole thing. It's all going to come together.
You're only going to get those spoilers here. But no, having that belief and that building that habit of diversity and bringing in those people and that iteration is something that I don't think some people sometimes lose sight of. I know Joe Barley talked about this in a previous episode here, where, taking the time to reflect on what went well and what went wrong. And that kind of leads into my next question of, you've had a lot of success in a lot of different areas. Where has a failure been that's ultimately led to a success in your life?
Oh, this is a really good one. It's one that I share with a lot of people, because I go back to when I was a field grade. Probably the one thing that I suffered from the most is a lack of patience, and that might seem like an oddball thing to say, but it was. And for somebody who has 3 kids, I should have had patience and then some. But what it was I worked for somebody who I think struggled to lead during my KD time. And instead of having the emotional intelligence and the patience to help him work through the challenges that he was dealing with, we almost had a conflict between us. I was impatient. I saw things before he did, and he was waiting, like say for us, he would wait for a situation to develop more before he was comfortable making decisions. And this kind of gets to our discussion of risk before we came online. Was I have a much more comfortable relationship with risk. I don't gamble, but I can look at a situation, I can assess the risk, and I learn to deal with that risk in such a way that I can maximize the chances of success, the likelihood of success, by addressing risk in different ways, and being comfortable with ambiguity as well as risk. I can go in a certain direction and I know I'm going to be okay. He wasn't like that. And so I would see a situation and say, we can do this. No, I need more information. I can't make a decision. And I would, that decision might wait days or weeks, and it would absolutely drive me insane. I worked with my counterpart, who's now a 3-star, was much more patient and much more understanding and much more adept at managing that personality than I was. And I walked away, and for the longest time, I blamed him. And you know, that the struggles that we had were because he couldn't make decisions, or he couldn't, but there were other things. And really, it took me, we're looking in and saying, I owned part of that failure, because he was somebody who needed senior staff who recognized where he had challenges and helped him work through those challenges, rather than somebody who got uptight about it and just badgered him. Make a decision. You make the decision. Okay, fine, I'll make the decision. And that wasn't the right thing to do. And like I said, my counterpart was far more successful at managing that personality than I was. And so I walked away. And one of the reasons why I ended up being much more successful later on in my career was I walked away with that lesson, and I learned the importance of managing those personalities. Because everybody that you work for is going to be a little bit different, and really what they need surrounding them are people who can help them make decisions, not make the decisions for them. And you know, that's just all you can do, is put yourself in a position where you can do that to the best of your abilities, and then help them make those decisions. And that gives you value as a senior staff officer, or as a leader in any role. And that was a lesson I walked away, and it was a painful lesson. It's 2 years of being completely frustrated. The harder I pushed him to make decisions, the more he shut down, and the more frustrated I'd become, and the more I'd push, and the further he'd pull away. And it just, you know, it was a disaster. And then of course the staff had to deal with us both.
Yeah.
And I know that made people uncomfortable, and just, you know, it was a failure on my part. And learning that and being able to say I can do better allowed me to work at a much higher level with a much greater degree of success, because I had learned the humility of not having the patience to help somebody help themselves.
Yeah. And under recognizing too, when you do get into that vicious cycle, how to kind of come out of it, so you're not, you know, going deeper and deeper and deeper down that hole. And that's a tremendous lesson to take away. And like you said, you've been able to then that's allowed you to increase your emotional intelligence, your self-awareness, recognizing that a little bit faster, because it only takes one time. And then after that, you kind of start to see it faster and faster and faster.
Absolutely.
This has been great. Before we do wrap up, sir, I do want to kind of close with, and we talked about, you know, all these different things that you've been able to do throughout your career and life. How do you see that you're better than yesterday?
That's a great question. I'm a really goal-driven guy. Somewhere in this stack of books around here, I have the book, The Atomic Goals. And if you've ever read the book Atomic Goals, it's not only about goal setting, it's about milestones, it's about stretch goals. So everything in my life is built around goals. So I'll have a goal, I'll have stretch goals, I'll measure those. And so every day that goes by, I know I have improved in some area. I've stopped to reflect, to take measure of where I'm at, and then take a step forward. And it might be something little, you know. It was a realization today that I think I've walked my dogs every day that it hasn't rained for like almost a year.
Wow.
And that's not a big deal, but you think that's a mile a day with the dog where we spend together, you know, whatever. Always reading, always working towards self-improvement, and measuring all that. You know, I don't know if it was Joe or somebody else, Joe Barley or somebody else I talked to about, you know, I'm a fanatic for performance metrics. And so like I was out on a run this morning, and I come back and I check, you know, the VO2 levels, heart rate, all those kinds of things. Am I in the right zone? How long did I stay in that zone? Always looking towards improving in some little area, one way or another. Because I do this, and this is something I like to share with people, is I've never competed with anybody else. I compete with myself. And it's because if I set the bar against somebody else's performance, it's not going to be high enough. And I'm going to sell myself short. So I compete with myself. How do I get better every day? And how do you live life to its fullest? Where's that coffee cup? So my buddy, Sergeant Major Mike Burke sent me this. And we have a shared philosophy. It says always in pursuit. Where I did his podcast a couple of months ago. And the philosophy that drives that is the same thing that you're talking about. It's how do I know I'm better today than tomorrow? I am always in pursuit of my best self. And that drives everything I do. And I can't tell anybody else what to do, but I strongly encourage that tomorrow you should be better than you were today, and then the next day, and then the next day. Don't let a day go to waste. Always be better than you were. Always think about, what are you leaving behind for everybody else? What's your legacy? You control all those things. You don't want to be the 80-year-old guy who looks back and says, man, I didn't do anything in life. I want to be the 80-year-old guy who says, man, I'm tired. I'm going to yell at people in the front yard because I've done everything I need to do. You never stop pushing. You never stop trying to be better. You never stop looking for that next challenge. And that is something that I talked to my boss about today. That next challenge is what defines us. You've achieved something. What's the next challenge? How are you going to make yourself better? How are you going to push yourself to your limit? I think as long as you do that, life is fulfilling and you're happy. And you can just never stop. You're always in pursuit of your best self.
And that's, like you said, measure your success by owning your success.
Absolutely.
I can't think of a better way to say it. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time, sharing your insight. So excited about the book. And of course, last but certainly not least, thank you for having our six.
Oh, hey, Tony, thanks for having me on here. I really appreciate it.
I don't know what you've been told, Sixers, but the lawyers would like us to remind you that the views, opinions, and comments expressed on the Got Your Six podcast are solely those of the hosts or guests, to include current and previous Department of Defense employees, and should in no way be considered the opinions of or endorsements on behalf of the Department of Defense or any of its components, divisions, contractors, or other current and previous staff members.